live. All right, so now I've got the YouTube address. I'll put that somewhere. I'll put that in. Course activity video so that people can see it. All right, almost there. I think it's a holiday weekend or week in the United States. Page, publish page. And let's just do a quick test, because when I don't test, things go bad. Okay, so .ca and Activity Center. Load this puppy. And all right, very good. So let's put myself on the screen. Got it. All right, so here I am. Hi, folks. It's always fuzzy, and I don't know why. Maybe it's just a Zoom thing. I don't know. It's hard to say. So, like I say, it was a bit late getting the URLs up today, and so I can imagine Mark, if he's trying to log in, sort of looking for links to log in from. I'm terrible at this. I really need to fix this so that it's all automatic, so that I don't have to update the activity center every day that I'm running a meeting. Here we go. Oh, should be recording. Second meeting of the day. Oh, I'm waiting for Mark to come in. I'll set up slides. There we go. There we go. Now we're good.
I'm gonna finish my breakfast first couple of minutes and I'll turn my camera on.
All right. So why don't then, if take your time eating your breakfast, and I'll just introduce this week with the slides that I have. You can sit back, relax, and enjoy them. It's not that long, and then we can talk about it after. How does that sound?
Sounds like a plan.
All right. I like plans.
Me too.
Okay. So just starting up the audio recording. So welcome to Ethics, Analytics, and the Duty of Care, Module 6. This is the introduction to Module 6, and I got slides, and the slides are titled Introduction to the Duty of Care. So let's see what they look like when I put them on the screen. There we go. Share. How does that look? That should look good, eh? Yeah, I think that looks fine. Oh, it disappears when I do that, though, doesn't it? Okay. So I'm going to stop share. I'm going to move this over. I'm going to start share. There we go.
It looked fine to me.
All right.
There you go.
Yeah. So yeah, this module is titled The Duty of Care, and this particular presentation is introduction to the duty of care, and I'm doing double duty by doing the presentation in our conversation section, which creates confusion for the course archives later, but I'll work that out later. So where we start, when we start talking about the duty of care, is with what might be called data ethics of power. And it's kind of where we left off when we were talking about approaches to ethics, and especially, who speaks for us when we're talking about ethics. And this particular paper that I'm referring to talks about data ethics, but it could be talking about ethics generally. And Guy Hasselbach writes, a data ethics of power can be described as a type of postmodernist, or in essence, vitalist call for a specific kind of ethical action to free the living/human being from the constraints of the practices of control embedded in the technological infrastructures of modernity that at the same time reduce the value of the human being, which is a bit of a mouthful. But I think we can get a sense of what Gray is after here by, in the words of one Danish minister, at the launch of a data ethics expert group, he says, this is about what society we want. And, maybe the scholars of history would say that we're progressing toward a more liberal and more progressive society. But I think also, if we're going to look at it that way, we're progressing toward a society where individuals are more free, but more free can be discussed and defined in a variety of ways. So it's not really helpful. But the idea here is to try to define ethics and to try to define the society that we want as something that is more human. And it's a reaction to not only new technology and surveillance and things like that, but it's a reaction to industrialization in general, to technocracy in general, perhaps even to the military-industrial complex, and to the dynamics of the modern nation state, which are all about management, control, hierarchy, and power. And this is a reaction to that. So what does that reaction look like? Well, it's a move away from what Robert Nozick called coercive philosophy. In coercive philosophy, as he says, arguments are power and best when they are knocked down. Arguments force you to a conclusion. Now, we know that this isn't the case. We've learned, as we've all of society, or at least that part of society that's connected, has engaged in this process of argument, that sometimes the opposite is the fact. The argument doesn't force anyone to a conclusion. If anything, it forces people who disagree with you to retrench. It's like what we see with a lot of the radical or alt-right sites like Parler. Parler is a site that was set up by neoconservatives as a response to Facebook and Twitter. They were responding against what they perceived as censorship, and so set up their own website. And the thing is, if you engage in arguments with the proprietors of a site like Parler, you're actually doing what they would like. You're not convincing them that they're wrong, rather you are granting them legitimacy and, if you will, actually feeding the beast. That's why they say, don't feed the trolls. Getting into an argument is what they want. And it's hard to come to grips with this idea that, argument fails. But it does tell us that, moral and ethical values are, in a certain sense, different from and perhaps deeper than argument. And Sharita is joining us today. So we'll just give Sharita a couple of seconds here to join. And she will see, as soon as she's able to see, which I assume is now, that I've started in on a short presentation, beginning with the introduction of the duty to care, introduction to the duty of care. Let's try that right. Talking about the reaction to data ethics of power, where this new type of ethics is postmodernist or even vitalist, to free the human being from the constraints of the practices of control and try to define the sort of society that we want. And the society that we want is something that is beyond argument, as we've seen in the past in our experience of trolls and the information wars. Getting into arguments with the other side is often just what the other side wants. You're just feeding the trolls, feeding the beast. So what does this new kind of society look like? Well, with respect to something like Parler and perhaps similar sites, we have no real obligation to try to argue for our views or convince them of anything. The response, I think, has been mostly that we can recognize Parler for what it is and deplatform the site simply because we find it repugnant and offensive. And if you don't like the example of Parler, pick your own example, right? You can find something that's repugnant and offensive and say, okay, well, we'll deplatform that. And that's what leads us into something like an ethics of care. Now, I'm quoting from David Weinberger here, which is maybe exactly the wrong sort of person I should be quoting for the first mention really of ethics of care, but I'll live with that. And really here, he says, instead, thinking about morality in terms of relationships with distinct and particular individuals to whom we owe some responsibility of care. It takes as its fundamental and grounding moral behavior the caring of a mother for a child. Now, how literally you want to take that might be a subject of discussion and debate, but that's the starting point that we're working from here. Okay, let's cash that out a little bit. And I've got a train going by here, so everything in the room is shaking. So where we begin with this kind of discussion is with a thing called the duty of care, which applies to healthcare professionals. And I'll start here because it ties back into all of the discussion of ethical codes that we had earlier and the way ethics sort of reformulated itself into this discussion of ethical codes, especially codes for professionals. And these have their basis in what we call a duty of care. Now, it's a legal duty. There's also a moral and ethical and professional aspect to it as well. But the beginning of this is in something called the snail in the bottle case in 1932. It actually took place at a restaurant in Coffs Harbour, where the one person bought a bottle of, I think it was root beer, or root ale or ginger ale or something like that in a dark bottle. You can see it there. I was sort of hoping the picture of the bottle would tell me what it was, but anyhow, pour out of the bottle into the glass, have a drink, refresh the glass, and out pops a snail, a decomposing snail. That's actually happened to me in the past, not with ginger ale and not with a snail, but the same sort of thing. And it's really gross and disgusting and horrible. The question is, did the people who created and bottled the ginger beer have any responsibility toward the person, and especially the ill effects suffered by the person who eventually consumed the beverage? And the court decided in a split decision that yes, they did. That they had an obligation of care to whomever purchased the product. That there was this relationship here, and you couldn't just serve ginger beer and say buyer beware. And that's where it begins. And since then, it develops quite a bit. And I'm jumping over, and in other presentations, we'll look at more of the details. But the idea here is that it develops into a formal legal principle, specifically a legal obligation, and I'm quoting here from Wikipedia, a legal obligation which is imposed on an individual requiring adherence to a standard of reasonable care while performing any acts that could foreseeably harm others. Now, that's quite different from the concept of care with mother and child. And I think we need to keep these two senses in mind, because I think in the actual discussion of these, there's a lot of overlap between them, even though we have two distinct perspectives, two distinct points of view, the one being the care from the mother's perspective, the other being the care from the professional's perspective. Oops, wrong way. So one of the big distinctions, I think, between a mother's care and a professional care is to whom that care is owed. Here I'm quoting from Pfeffer, who's the author of one of these ethical code discussions that we talked about way back in Module 3, writing, as a representative of the company, you have one set of responsibilities. As a concerned private citizen, you have another set of responsibilities. It's nice when those converge, but that's not always the case. We see that with professional ethics a lot, and I think we talked about it specifically, where a profession like a doctor or a lawyer or whomever, so anyone working in a company or for an institution, a school, a university, they have a responsibility toward their client, but they also have a responsibility toward their employer. And I think we can say here that with this discussion, the attempt is being made to tip the balance away from the formal institutional structure of employment and management and toward the client or the person who is actually in your care. There's also a story about where care comes from. And if you're like me and you're a prickly analytic and you want to know where things come from and what causes things and how everything works, you're sitting there and you're saying right off the bat, well, what do you mean by care? And you want all of these definitions of care, and I can have another one of my database things with all the different elements of care, but I also want a sense of what it means in terms of ethics. What, if you will, what's the biological story? So here is a depiction of it, and I stress a depiction of it. First off, beginning with the observation that not just humans, but animals in general, maybe not all, but certainly some, care for themselves and show care for others. And these behaviors are evolutionary behaviors. You can see that in the relation between a duck and ducklings, or a mother cat and kittens, etc. It's not universal. Some animals will just push them out of the nest and say good luck. But certainly we do see it. But it is a discussion to have as to whether care, properly so called, is something that is unique to humans. I'm inclined to be skeptical about that. This comes from, we are told, an attachment, which is essentially dispositions to extend care to others. Now, this is very, when I use a phrase like dispositions to extend care to others, that's almost like using behaviorist language. And I don't want to use behaviorist language to describe this, but we'll use that for now. We'll say, okay, attachment equals care, right? To care for something is to be attached to it, or perhaps result from attaching to it. So the gender-specific account of care comes from the specific idea that when a mother has a child or a kitten or whatever, right? The placenta releases hormones. These act on neurons and create something like a nesting urge. Now, I cannot attest to the accuracy of that biological principle, right? I am not a biologist, and I never will be a biologist. So I'm depending very much on second or third hand sources for this. But it is plausible, prima facie, that there are psychological effects from giving birth. It would shock me if there weren't. But, again, not having the expertise in the subject, I can't comment on it a whole lot. But this results in almost a convergence of self-interest and interest to others, or as I've characterized it here, where protect myself tactics feel the same as protect mine tactics. And I think that's the important thing here, right? I've told a biological story, but if I were going to tell a story about ethics here, it's not going to be a kind of biological naturalism. This is a theory that might explain where it comes from, but where it comes from doesn't tell us what it is. It just tells us where it comes from. And I think the actual ethical importance here is how these things feel, right? How the social animals caring for each other actually feel about each other. What attachment feels like. Is that a sensation? What does the sensation of attachment feel like? And similarly, what does the protect mine sensation feel like? And that will form the basis for our ethics, I think. But we have to go a ways to get to that. A way of characterizing it is as empathy. I'm not really going to say that empathy captures all and only care, but there is an aspect there, and we can get an intuitive sense as to what we mean when we talk of ethics as empathy. When people talk about empathy, they're not talking about following rules. They're not talking about making arguments. They're not talking about adhering to principles. they're not even talking about standards of behavior or anything like that. It's captured in this quote from Albert Camus, The Plague. This whole thing is not about heroism, it's about decency, right? And this idea, this sense of basic decency, this sense of basic empathy for others is probably closer to what we mean by a duty of care. Again, I'm glossing over a lot here because this is just an introduction, but we'll look at that in more detail. So in the literature, we get various dimensions of care. And so, yeah, here I am, the analytic who actually did slice and dice it. But again, I'm not going to consider all of this definitive of care. And I'm not even going to say that these are separate and distinct properties of care. All I'm going to say is that these are words or concepts that came up in the literature when people were trying to define what they meant by care. And so they mean things like empathy, social justice, equity, cultural responsiveness, inclusion, empowerment, and I could probably add more. And we, that may be one of the things that we think about in this module. What are these dimensions of care? Does it make sense to draw them out and list them? Can we talk about what they look like in both our feeling of care and then in the practice of care? One subject that comes up, and I alluded to it briefly earlier when I asked whether care is essentially human, and of course I was comparing humans with animals here, but a question that can be asked is whether care is restricted to biological life or carbon-based life. Maria Puig contests the view that care is something that only humans do. I'm reading from a review on Amazon, and argues for extending to non-humans the consideration of agencies and communities that make the living web of care by considering how care circulates in the natural world. And there are various approaches to understanding care that suggest that this may be possible. Now, this points to a bit of a dilemma in the concept of care, right? If you think that care has its basis in a maternal instinct, then it's something that really is not possible for computers, because we can't really think of computers as having a maternal instinct. But if you think of care as a feeling that can be described as a result of various sensations, then maybe that is something that a machine can have. Or if you become more instrumentalist or functionalist or operationalist, and you think of care not so much as the sensations, but rather the practice, the attitudes, and even the mechanisms, then clearly care is something that can be done by a machine. And part of this is how much either of these things matter, right? Does it matter if the feeling of care accompanies the practice of care? Or can you conduct the practice of care without the feeling of care? And I find that an interesting question. In our field, a lot of this, and frankly, still at a fairly superficial level, leads us into something that we can call a pedagogy of care. I'm quoting from Maha Bali here, who's written about it. And she puts a pedagogy of care into terms of equity and justice, saying one of the most empowering ways to redress justice is to put power of decision-making into the hands of those furthest from justice. And this takes us back to the very beginning where we were talking about data ethics of power. And so it's a question of, is care something to do with the power relationship? Is care something to do with the nurturing relationship? Is care something to do with the sensation or feeling? So what we'll do in this module is basically go through these. I'm not going to call them arguments because that's not the right way to think of this. Go through these differing accounts of what we mean by care and what we think care is, to try to come out with something like a coherent story about care. And I think it's only going to be a story. I mean, I don't think we're going to have a full-blown theory with laws, rules, and principles, but maybe we can approach an understanding of what we mean by ethics when we talk about ethics and analytics from the perspective of duty of care. So that's my intro. So I'll stop sharing slides and get your responses to that. And I was, Sharita, watching your face throughout.
Yeah.
You are very expressive.
I am, yes. I've been told not to play poker. Yeah.
So, any first thoughts?
Well, the first thoughts that I have is a while ago, I did some research on trust, specifically online trust. And one of the things that I thought about, and one of the things that I read that was fairly new as opposed to, let's say, 30, 40 years old view on how trust was formed, was that empathy was really one of the antecedents of trust. That if you could communicate empathy in an environment, let's say, where you don't have a face or whatever, it tended to begin the process of trust. So what's going around in my mind then is, if care is somehow involved with some kind of empathy, some kind of empathic behavior, and that in a way is connected to trust, is the duty of care somehow related to trust in a situation? Does that make any sense? I know I'm skipping something.
Well, it makes sense to me. So, I mean, again, I'm coming at this as the analytic philosopher.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, to me, it sounds like a causal chain from trust and perhaps trust forming mechanisms to this connection to create empathy, which in turn leads to or is part of care. Does that sound like a characterization?
Sort of. Yeah, sort of. I mean, I look at trust and empathy as a chicken and egg kind of thing,
Sure.
in that they revolve around each other. And if you were to take that frame, then in a way, you are looking at care.
Yeah.
Or another entity.
So that's interesting. Let me throw a rock into your pond.
Okay. That's fine.
So I'm a devotee, less so now than I used to be, of something called fail videos. And you might not know what fail videos are. Certainly a lot of the viewers won't. Basically, a fail video is when somebody tries to do something and fails.
Mhm.
Pardon?
Spectacularly.
Spectacularly. I actually sat down a while back and tried to think, to myself, what are the components of a good fail video, right? Because there's lots of failure out there in the world, but a good fail video will include the spectacular element. Sometimes the best ones include, an element that's unexpected, right? And that's where the fail website has actually begun to, if you will, fail me recently, and why I'm less interested now. There's any number of people on a skateboard sliding down the rail, losing their balance, and landing with the rail right between their legs.
Mhm.
Right. That's a fail. Now, that gets me because when they do that, I go, oh, right. So, and that I attribute to empathy, right? More accurately, that seems to me to be a feeling of empathy, right?
Mhm.
And the more spectacular and the more unusual the fail, the more I'm inclined to feel this sort of empathy. I'm trying to think of an unexpected way of failing. It's like they slide down the rail, everything's perfect. I'm expecting them to lose their balance, but no, they land, they're rolling along, and then a car hits them.
Mhm.
That's unexpected. Or I saw a video just yesterday, person standing or on their bike or in their car or whatever, they're looking at an intersection, and you see the two cars approach each other. There's a collision. One of them goes flipping off the side of the screen. Wait 2 beats. Then another car sort of rolls along with the flipping car on top of it. Yeah. Now, I didn't feel so much empathy there because I didn't see any people. All I'm seeing are cars. But anyhow, the rock in the pond part of this is there's no trust anywhere here. I'm watching these things, and when they're well done, I'm having this feeling of, oh no. And that feeling to me seems to be the empathy. Would that make me trust them more? No, it would make me trust them less because they're
Yeah.
so, but that's not to disagree with what you're saying. But it is to suggest that there might be varieties of empathy.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that. Hang on, let me look that up quickly. Hey, why not? It might be another database. Varieties of empathy. Let's see if anyone has thought of that before. Of course they have, right? Okay, so we have in a website called theskillsyouneed.com, which is promoted by Google, apparently. There are 3 types of empathy: cognitive, emotional, and compassionate.
Ah.
So maybe the one that I'm talking about is emotional, and the one that you're talking about is compassionate. And I'm not sure what cognitive empathy would even look like, but
Don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, we'd have to look it up. I'm not
Yeah.
going to spend our video looking things
Yeah.
up on Google, but
So that may be,
yeah.
a way of looking at it.
And then there's this whole thing about mirror neurons. Yeah. So mirror neurons.
Mirror neurons. Cool.
So just a quick quoting from some U.S. government site. Okay. Mirror neurons are a class of neuron that modulate their activity both when an individual executes a specific motor act and when they observe the same or similar act performed by another individual. So I guess the idea here is, and that's consistent with what I've read before. The idea is that when you do something and have a feeling, that say, that creates, that stimulates neurons in the head. Like, for example, right now I'm feeling a little pain from that, which was actually a bit unexpected. Then if you were to do the same thing, and I would observe you, some, although certainly not all, of the neurons in my head that reacted to when I did this would react when you did this, producing presumably similar feelings. And so the theory is that that's the basis for empathy, are these similar feelings produced when you have, or when you do something, or you have an experience similar to when I produce something, when I do something or have a feeling. So maybe mirror neurons certainly seem to be a thing. And it's not surprising that they would occur, because at the very least the visual perception is similar, so why wouldn't some of the neural reactions be similar? Do they tie into thing, and can we found in ethics on them, is, I think, a bit of a different story.
Empathy also has to do, when you're doing therapy, if you mirror somebody's emotions, or if you mirror, through words, show your understanding, empathy of what a person goes through. That's one of the ways that you establish a relationship with the other person, right?
Good point.
So, and that's considered being empathetic. And in many ways, you're trained to do that. When you're doing certain forms of therapy. And that in turn, trying to think, mirroring, motion, and that in some turn, I think relates to the building of trust.
Yeah. I'm not sure where I've seen this, but I've heard of this being used, believe it or not, by pickup artists in bars.
Yes, I totally would believe that. Sure.
Yeah.
It's a form of manipulation, really. So,
oh yeah, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
So I wonder if ethics is based on manipulation. That's an interesting thought.
Well, it is supposed to be the opposite, but anyway, in my view.
Well, it is those manipulators that keep telling us what ethics we're supposed to be following.
Yeah.
Politicians.
Yeah, so it's not that ethics is completely free of the concept of manipulation. I know the concept under the heading of active listening.
Yes, okay.
And again, the idea of active listening is you listen to what they said, and then you repeat back, not their words, but your own interpretation of what they said. Which is sort of what I'm doing here. But of course, that can be misused too. I was reading an article just the other day about how to do this when somebody is suffering from depression or whatever. And the instinct on the part of a lot of people is to say, oh yeah, I know how you feel. I've gone through the same thing. And I felt blah, 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 which of course is exactly the wrong thing to do, because you probably don't know how they feel. Although we feel like we know how they feel, don't we? At least I do. But, I think a lot of myself, so that might be mistaken. What do you think of all this, Mark? Does this make sense to you?
Well, it makes sense. But, I'm going to throw a pebble in your pond, I think. So you sort of drove by biological determinism.
Zip right by it.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is good. But you brought in the conversation. So I just wanted to share that I immediately thought, why do men have nipples? So I did want to drop that into your determinism. And you used a man for your example of a feminist theory. So, but I understand. You even commented on it.
Yeah.
So there's
I felt
that.
badly about it.
Yeah, no, I understand. So anyway, those were just that's just me being me. But as far as artificial intelligence and analytics and empathy, that's where I hit the wall. And again with your mirror neurons, another more neurological determinism. Not that, it is true. And I've always used it. I always thought it was the basis of learning more than empathy, monkey see, monkey do kind of thing. I never thought of it in terms of empathy, so I will think about that. But based on our prior discussions, you've convinced me that AI is unstoppable and ethics are, I shouldn't use the word infinite. Ethics have nothing to do with the spread of AI. And so then my question, and I question whether technology can be used in an empathetic way. As someone who's been using way too much technology, way too much of my time for way too long, to me, it seems to inhibit empathy. And, it's a problem everybody's working on. I took Mahabali's class last summer. She co-taught with me as Zamora at Digital Pedagogy Labs.
Very good.
And, we talked about the duty of care a bit, but we certainly, in my opinion, didn't make any progress on how we can use this technology to provide care to, in that case, to students or colleagues. So that's where I'm stuck. So that's what I have to say. I'm sort of stuck in how AI or digital technology in general can promote care. It seems to me to inhibit it.
And I think that reflects a dominant trend in the literature overall. Go through any number of writers. Donald Clark just referenced Jaron Lanier. I've forgotten how to pronounce the name. Oh, dang. I'm so terrible with names. Sorry, I'm just looking it up. That's not him. Jaron. Dang. Here it is. Jaron. I think it's just Lanier, Lanier, Jaron, Jaron. And I know him especially from the video series All Wrapped Up in Machines of Loving Grace.
Right. Oh, that's a blast from the past. Yes.
Oh, wait, that wasn't him, though. That was someone else.
No, that was
Curry?
could be.
Lanier, though, advances arguments along a similar vein.
But that documentary film, though, is
it was terrific.
Yeah.
All watched over by Machines of Loving Grace. It was by Adam Curtis.
That's it.
Yeah, terrific series.
All of his films are dark and terrific.
So, but it's, I think it's an empirical question still. I think that because the machines are still under development, we don't actually know whether they could be empathetic and caring. It would sure be nice if they could, because that's way better than the alternative. In which machines are uncaring and dystopian and interact with us along the lines of machine guns on robot dogs, right? Which is not a caring relationship. But
That's
yeah,
my position as well. And I constantly say we're at the very beginning of this. I mostly work in distance and higher education. And so I have to keep saying we're at the very beginning of this. And the culture has to adapt.
mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, our tiptoe through ethics has made me a little less positive than when I arrived. And I wasn't all that positive to begin with. So this is, so that's where I'm at so far in the course. I'm hoping to turn it around here and to see how the culture can mitigate the negative effects and promote the positive effects.
Yeah.
But then you did bring up power. And here we are, in a very hierarchical capitalist system.
Yeah.
And it's a small group of people that control the direction of this, of these machines and how they evolve. And that's very worrisome.
We can teach people to have the outward behavior and appearance of empathy. We can teach people to have that. So given that given machine learning, given that it at this point starts from some kind of human involvement, can we not teach machines to be empathic?
Well,
at least in terms of behavior.
Appear to be.
I was going to ask, right? Yeah, when we teach people to be empathic, we're teaching the overt behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Does it follow that they eventually feel empathic? And that's an argument in psychology where it says, yes, you can do that. Yeah. Right. And that argument has been made. There's some pretty good sources for that. William James, in Principles of Psychology, suggests that this is what happens. As well, Soren Kierkegaard, from a religious context, talks about taking a leap of faith.
Yeah.
And the idea is that if you practice your faith over time, you will come to believe your faith. And I think that we can see that empirically, at least in the sense of, people report that this happens, that they do something, they create a habit or whatever, and then they begin to have the feelings associated with that habit. So arguably that could happen with empathy. Would that happen if we taught a machine that way? Or are feelings intrinsic to human embodiment? But then again, could there be a machine embodiment that's just as good?
Yeah.
But
do either of you know anybody on the autism spectrum personally?
No. And well, although that said, I wouldn't know if I did. I work in a research center full of scientists. Odds are pretty good that I do.
Yeah. I was going to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have known a couple of people on the spectrum, and they work very hard to appear empathetic and engaged and caring and,
Yeah.
But they have to talk themselves into it. Even I've known people in their 60s. Of course, there was no such thing as a scale when they were children. The one I'm speaking of actually is a very good scientist. But she, even in her 60s, has to constantly remind herself to present in an acceptable way. So based on my experience, I'm doubtful that a machine would learn anything that we would call empathy. Now, behavior, yeah, we can modify. So then that gets back to trust. So as someone who's worked with machines their whole life, I do not trust machines. Nope. From taking apart my Volkswagen as a teenager to working in one of the most advanced technological glass blowing facilities in Silicon Valley. It only got, as I moved up in the technology world, it only got more difficult to humans. So that one, you're going to have a real hard time convincing me of. Because machines are faster and stronger and heavier. And then you get down to the real simple things. If a machine falls on you, you are dead. That's it. Story ends.
Well, depends on the machine, and
if it's
but I know what you mean.
Yeah, if it's an order of magnitude heavier than you, that's it. You know, I mean, that's the thing. There's no negotiating. There's no, it's over. And I worked with electricity, explosive gases, and I met people that have been damaged by technology. So even though I spent my whole life in technology, it's dangerous, and now I thought I was doing a good thing helping to make computer chips. Now I realize it was way more dangerous than I ever imagined. So that's part of my skeptical attitude. Unfortunately, I have. And it's not popular in some sense.
Well, it's funny, we could make the leap from what you've just said to saying something like machines are malicious and evil. And that would, I know, but that's a leap people wouldn't have nearly as much difficulty making.
True.
Well, when you give them artificial intelligence, then you can start making those kind of arguments. I was just talking about physics, but now if you're talking about artificial intelligence, robot quadrupeds, I'm not going to call them dogs.
I can't resist.
I know, and that's why they use the term, because it's irresistible.
I know.
And we don't talk enough about dominating cultures and propaganda and all that. Because that's what goes through my mind when I hear anybody talk in higher education, politics. I even went to church as a class project, virtually as a class project, something I haven't done in 50, 60 years. And as people talk, I just, that's my little bit of education is in sociology, and I'm like, what is this person trying to do with this group? And I just can't get away from that now. Now that I got that in my head, that's, so, I'm just constantly critical of groups.
There's a bunch of threads that we can tug at this week. And we will. I've got 12:57 here, so I'm just sort of moving into wrap-up mode. I'm sorry, because this was a pretty good discussion, and I want it to go on for a long time. But at least we have Friday again to revisit some of this. I'm going to look especially at some of the ethics of care philosophers, people like Carol Gilligan, Nell Noddings, and others, and talk about how that influences our topic. And even if we can't make our machines love us, and even if they only hate us, I think there's some interesting things we'll be able to say. And I'm not trying to convince you that machines will care for us. Like I say, I still think that's an open question. But the interesting question here is, how would we know? what are the criteria, if we can even speak in those terms, of caring for us? How would we know if a machine cares for us or not? And does it matter if they do the right sort of thing? And even more to the point, what lessons can we draw from this discussion of care with respect to the wider topic? How does it inform us about what are ethics in terms of analytics and AI with respect to learning? I know there are some things that we can learn from it, but again, we have to look at that to see what it is. So I'll have more videos. I apologize at the same time I make a promise. But I'm also going to be including more readings in the newsletter so that you're not dependent on my videos. And I think that's something I should have been doing from the start, which I haven't been doing. And as well, I'll try to improve some of the activities that the course offers. They've been pretty lame so far, although I've been trying. But I think there are things that I can do. But we'll see how that goes. It all depends on time, of course. If you have suggestions or ideas, by all means. And certainly, I encourage you to blog some thoughts about how care ties into ethics and learning analytics specifically. I think that would be helpful. Certainly, this discussion's been very helpful to me already. So that's a good start. Any last words before I close off the recording? No. All right. Well, it was good to see you and talk to you both again. Thanks for joining me.